What if I told you that the very habit you've been praising yourself for, diligently saving money every single month, watching your bank balance slowly climb, feeling responsible and disciplined, is actually the exact same habit that's quietly keeping you from ever becoming genuinely wealthy? I know how strange that sounds. We've all been taught from childhood that saving money is the responsible thing to do, the smart thing to do, the opposite of being reckless with your finances. And to be fair, saving is genuinely important. But here's the uncomfortable truth that almost nobody explains clearly. Saving and investing are not the same thing. They are not interchangeable, and treating them as if they're the same behavior is exactly why so many disciplined, hard-working savers end up decades into their careers wondering why their bank balance never quite turned into real wealth. Today, we're going to break down exactly what separates saving from investing, why so many people get permanently stuck in the saving phase without ever transitioning into the investing phase, and most importantly, exactly how to make that transition yourself, step by step, starting with whatever amount of money you currently have sitting in your savings account right now. This is a longer, more detailed video than usual, because this transition genuinely deserves it, so stay with me all the way through, because the practical roadmap near the end is where this entire video becomes something you can actually use in your own life starting today. Let's start by clearly defining the difference between saving and investing, because this distinction, simple as it sounds, is where almost everything else in this video is built from. Saving is the act of setting money aside and keeping it safe, typically in a bank account, where its primary job is preservation and accessibility rather than growth. When you save money, you're essentially saying, I want this money to still be here, exactly as I left it, whenever I need it. The priority is safety and liquidity, being able to access that money quickly and reliably, without worrying about it losing value in some dramatic, sudden way. Investing, on the other hand, is the act of putting your money into something with the specific intention of growing it over time, typically by accepting some degree of short-term risk or fluctuation in exchange for the potential of significantly greater long-term returns. When you invest money, you're essentially saying, I'm willing to let this money's value move up and down in the short term because I believe, based on historical evidence, that it will grow significantly larger over the long term than it would simply sitting in a savings account. These are fundamentally different jobs for your money to be doing, and the mistake so many people make is using saving-style thinking for money that should actually be doing investing-style work. This mismatch, more than almost any other single factor, is responsible for why so many disciplined savers never actually build substantial wealth, despite years, sometimes decades, of consistently putting money aside. So why does this mismatch happen so often? Even among people who genuinely understand, at least intellectually, that investing tends to produce better long-term returns than saving. Let's break down the specific reasons, because understanding why you might be stuck in pure saving mode is the first step toward actually moving beyond it. The first reason is that saving feels safer, and that feeling of safety is incredibly powerful, even when it's not entirely accurate. When you check your savings account, the number you see is exactly the number that will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, barring any withdrawals. This predictability creates a powerful sense of control and security. Investing, by contrast, involves watching numbers move up and down, sometimes significantly, which can feel uncomfortable, even alarming, especially to someone who hasn't yet built the experience or emotional resilience to understand that these fluctuations are a completely normal, expected part of the long-term investing process. The second reason is that many people simply never received clear guidance on how to actually make the transition from saving to investing. They know, in a general sense, that investing exists, and that it's probably a good idea. But the actual mechanics, how to open an investment account, what to actually invest in, how much to invest, how to think about risk, feel confusing, technical, and intimidating. Faced with that confusion, the path of least resistance is simply continuing to do what already feels comfortable and familiar. Saving money in the same account they've always used, rather than pushing through the discomfort of learning something new. The third reason is a subtle psychological trap called mental accounting, where people categorize their savings account as their entire financial safety net, their entire sense of security, and become reluctant to move any portion of it elsewhere, even money that's genuinely excess beyond what they need for actual emergencies. The savings account starts to feel like the foundation of their entire financial identity, and moving money out of it, even into something that would likely grow significantly more over time, can feel unsettling, like removing a brick from beneath their own feet. The fourth reason, and this one deserves special attention, is that many people don't actually understand how much of their savings is genuinely necessary for safety, versus how much is simply excess money that's been accumulating because they never made an active decision about what to do with it beyond continuing to save it. Without a clear framework for distinguishing between these two categories, it's easy to let your entire savings balance grow indefinitely in the same low-yield account, treating every dollar the same way, when in reality, different portions of your money deserve fundamentally different treatment. Now let's build that framework together, because this is genuinely one of the most important mental shifts in this entire video. Not all of your money needs to be treated the same way. Different money, based on when you'll actually need it, deserves a different strategy entirely. Think of your money as existing in three distinct buckets, each with a different purpose, a different timeline, and therefore a fundamentally different appropriate strategy. The first bucket is your emergency fund, money specifically set aside to cover unexpected expenses or a sudden loss of income. This money genuinely should stay in a savings-style account, ideally a high-yield savings account, rather than a traditional low-interest one, because the priority here is safety and immediate accessibility, not growth. Most financial guidance suggests this bucket should hold somewhere between 3 to 6 months of essential living expenses, though this can vary depending on your specific job stability, health situation, and personal comfort level with risk. The second bucket is money for near-term goals, expenses you know you'll need within the next 1 to 3 years. Things like a house down payment, a wedding, a planned major purchase, or a specific short-term financial goal. This money generally shouldn't be exposed to significant investment risk either, because if the market happens to drop right before you need that money, you might be forced to withdraw it at a loss, precisely when you need it most. High-yield savings accounts, short-term certificates of deposit, or conservative money market funds are typically more appropriate homes for this particular bucket of money. The third bucket, and this is where the actual transition from saving to investing needs to happen, is money you won't need for at least 5 years and ideally much longer. Money earmarked for genuinely long-term goals like retirement, financial independence, or simply building long-term wealth without a specific near-term purpose attached to it. This is exactly the money that should be moved out of a simple savings account and into actual investments, because over long time horizons, historical market data consistently shows that investing significantly outperforms saving, more than enough to justify accepting some short-term fluctuation along the way. Here's where so many people go wrong, and it's worth naming directly because recognizing this pattern in your own financial life is genuinely the first step toward fixing it. Many disciplined savers accumulate far more money in their first and second buckets than they actually need, simply because they never took the time to clearly identify how much genuinely belongs there. Instead, their entire savings balance, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, sits in a single, low-yield account, treated as one undifferentiated pile of money, when in reality, a significant portion of it, everything beyond genuine emergency needs and specific near-term goals, should have been moved into that third bucket and actually invested years earlier. Now let's talk about exactly how to make this transition, step by step, because understanding the framework is only useful once it becomes something you can actually apply to your own specific financial situation. Step 1 is calculating your actual emergency fund target. Sit down and calculate your essential monthly expenses, rent or mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, minimum debt payments, and multiply that number by however many months of coverage feels appropriate for your specific situation, typically somewhere between 3 and 6 months. This gives you a clear, specific dollar target for bucket 1, rather than a vague, ever-growing pile of savings with no defined endpoint. Step 2 is identifying any genuine near-term goals and calculating what you'll need for those specifically. If you're planning a wedding in 18 months or saving for a house down payment you expect to use within the next 2 years, calculate that specific amount and treat it as bucket 2, kept in a safe, accessible account, separate from both your emergency fund and your long-term investments. Step 3, and this is the step most people skip entirely, is calculating exactly how much money you currently have sitting in savings beyond what buckets 1 and 2 actually require. This is often a genuinely eye-opening exercise. Many people discover they have significantly more excess savings than they realized, money that's been sitting there, quietly losing value to inflation, simply because it was never actively assigned a purpose beyond generic, undefined safety. Step 4 is opening an actual investment account if you don't already have one, specifically designated for this third bucket of long-term money. This doesn't need to be complicated. A simple brokerage account or a retirement account, if you haven't already maximized available tax-advantaged options like an employer-sponsored retirement plan, works perfectly well for this purpose. The specific platform matters far less than simply taking the step of opening an account designed for long-term investing, separate from your everyday savings and checking accounts. Step 5 is choosing straightforward, diversified investments, rather than getting overwhelmed trying to pick individual stocks or overly complex investment strategies. For most people making this transition for the first time, a broad market index fund or a simple diversified portfolio of index funds provides an excellent starting point, offering exposure to hundreds or even thousands of companies through a single investment, without requiring you to become an expert stock picker before you're allowed to begin. Step 6 is actually moving your excess savings, the amount you calculated in Step 3, into that investment account. Ideally, not all at once if the amount feels large and intimidating, but rather through a gradual, systematic approach if that helps you feel more comfortable with the transition. Some people prefer moving the entire excess amount at once, since historically, investing a lump sum as soon as possible tends to outperform spreading it out over time. Others prefer moving it gradually over several months, which can feel psychologically easier even if it's mathematically slightly less optimal. Either approach is genuinely fine, and choosing whichever one you'll actually follow through on consistently matters more than optimizing for a small mathematical edge. Step 7, and this is crucial for making this a permanent shift rather than a one-time event, is redirecting your ongoing monthly savings habit itself. Instead of continuing to funnel all your monthly savings into the same account you've always used, once your emergency fund and near-term goal buckets are already adequately funded, redirect that ongoing saving habit directly into your investment account instead. This is really the heart of turning saving into investing, not just moving a single lump sum once, but permanently redirecting the habit itself going forward. Let's talk through a concrete example to make this entire process feel more tangible, because abstract steps are much easier to understand when you can see them applied to real numbers. Imagine someone with $40,000 sitting in a traditional savings account, along with essential monthly expenses of $3,000. Using our framework, their emergency fund target, assuming 6 months of coverage, would be $18,000. Let's say they also have a near-term goal, a home down payment they're planning to use in about 18 months, requiring an additional $10,000. That means $28,000 of their total savings genuinely belongs in safe, accessible accounts. The remaining $12,000, money that's been sitting there with no specific purpose beyond generic security, represents excess savings that could be moved into actual long-term investments. If that $12,000 stays in a traditional savings account earning around 1% annually, after 20 years, it would grow to roughly $14,600. If instead it's invested in a diversified portfolio earning a historically reasonable average of 8% annually, that same $12,000 would grow to approximately $56,000 over that same 20-year period. That's a difference of over $41,000, generated entirely by simply moving already existing money from one bucket into another, without requiring this person to save a single additional dollar beyond what they'd already accumulated. Now, let's add the ongoing habit piece to this same example. If this person also redirects an additional $300 a month that they'd previously been adding to their savings account, moving it instead into their investment account going forward, that consistent monthly contribution, invested at that same 8% average annual return, would grow to roughly $177,000 over 20 years. Combined with the initial $56,000 from their redirected lump sum, this person's total long-term investment balance after 20 years would be approximately $233,000, compared to what would have been a relatively modest amount if they'd simply continued saving everything in a traditional low-yield account the entire time. This example illustrates something genuinely important about this entire topic. The actual behavior change required, moving money from one type of account into another and redirecting an existing habit toward a different destination, is remarkably small and manageable. But the long-term financial impact of that small behavioral shift is enormous, precisely because of how dramatically different growth rates compound over long periods of time. Now, let's address some common hesitations and fears that tend to come up when people consider making this transition, because acknowledging these concerns honestly is important, rather than pretending the transition feels effortless for everyone. One common fear is worrying about investing right before a market downturn, essentially fearing bad timing. This is a genuinely understandable concern, but it's worth remembering that market downturns are a normal, expected, and ultimately temporary part of long-term investing. Historically, markets have always eventually recovered from downturns and gone on to reach new highs, given sufficient time. The real risk isn't experiencing a temporary downturn, it's panicking and selling during that downturn, locking in losses that would have otherwise recovered over time. This is exactly why this transition should only involve money you genuinely won't need for at least 5 years, giving your investments enough time to recover from any short-term volatility along the way. Another common hesitation is simply not knowing where to start, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of investment options, platforms, and strategies available. The good news here is that you genuinely don't need to become a financial expert before making this transition. A simple, low-cost, diversified index fund, held consistently over a long period of time, has historically outperformed the majority of more complicated, actively managed investment strategies. Starting simple isn't a compromise, it's actually often the smarter choice, even compared to more complex approaches that require significantly more expertise and active management. A third common concern is worrying about liquidity, feeling nervous about not having immediate access to money that's been moved into investments. This concern is addressed directly by the bucket framework we discussed earlier. As long as your emergency fund and near-term goals remain appropriately funded in safe, accessible accounts, the money moved into long-term investments is specifically money you've already identified as not being needed for years, which means the reduced liquidity of that particular portion of your money isn't actually a meaningful drawback given its intended purpose. There's one more layer worth exploring here, because it explains why some people, even after intellectually understanding this bucket framework, still struggle to actually follow through with moving their excess savings into investments. For many people, their savings account balance has quietly become tied to their sense of self-worth and financial identity, especially if they grew up in a household where money was tight, or where a parent or grandparent frequently emphasized the importance of having a large cash cushion. Watching that number shrink, even when the money is simply being redirected into something that will likely grow faster elsewhere, can trigger a genuine emotional reaction that has very little to do with actual financial logic. Recognizing this emotional attachment for what it is, rather than mistaking it for sound financial reasoning, is an important part of actually following through with this transition, rather than understanding it intellectually while never actually acting on it. It's also worth addressing a specific variation of this hesitation that shows up especially often among people who experienced a period of genuine financial hardship at some point in their life: a job loss, a medical emergency, a stretch of unemployment, or growing up in a household that struggled financially. For these individuals, a large savings balance often represents more than just a financial safety net. It represents a kind of emotional insurance against a specific fear that once felt very real and immediate. This is a completely legitimate feeling, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. But it's worth gently separating the emotional need for security, which the emergency fund bucket is specifically designed to address, from the excess money sitting beyond that, which isn't actually providing additional meaningful security, just additional lost opportunity, since a well-funded emergency fund already covers the realistic risk being feared in the first place. Let's also talk briefly about how this transition should evolve over time, because turning saving into investing isn't a single event you complete once and then never revisit again. As your income grows, as your life circumstances change, marriage, children, a new home, a career change, your appropriate bucket sizes will likely need to be recalculated periodically. What counted as an adequate emergency fund at one income level or life stage might not be sufficient a few years later, and what counted as excess savings ready for investing might shift as your near-term goals evolve. A useful habit here is revisiting this entire framework roughly once a year, recalculating your essential expenses, reassessing any near-term goals on the horizon, and confirming that your excess savings are still being appropriately directed toward long-term investments rather than quietly accumulating once again in a low-yield account, simply because the initial transition happened once, years ago, and was never revisited since. Let's talk about the emotional and psychological side of this transition too, because the mechanics alone, while important, aren't always enough to actually motivate someone to follow through with this shift in their own life. Part of what makes this transition difficult is that saving feels like an accomplishment in itself, something to be proud of, while investing can initially feel like relinquishing control over money you worked hard to accumulate. Reframing this mentally can help significantly. Instead of thinking of this transition as giving up control over your money, think of it as finally putting your money to work, rather than letting it sit passively, quietly losing value to inflation while accomplishing nothing beyond simply existing in an account. The discipline required to save money in the first place is genuinely valuable and admirable. This transition isn't asking you to abandon that discipline. It's asking you to redirect that same discipline toward a strategy that actually accomplishes what you were trying to accomplish all along: building real, lasting financial security and wealth. It's also worth acknowledging that this transition doesn't need to happen all at once, in one dramatic, uncomfortable leap. You can start by simply moving a portion of your excess savings, testing the process, getting comfortable with how an investment account actually works, watching it fluctuate over the following months, and building genuine confidence and familiarity before moving additional amounts. There's no rule requiring you to complete this entire transition in a single afternoon. What matters far more is actually beginning the process, rather than continuing to let your excess savings sit indefinitely in an account that was never designed to grow your money in the first place. One final practical note before we wrap up. If you're currently sitting on a large amount of excess savings and feel genuinely nervous about the idea of moving a significant chunk of it into investments all at once, there's nothing wrong with easing into this transition gradually rather than treating it as an all-or-nothing decision. You might start by moving just 20 or 30% of your identified excess savings this month. Observe how it feels over the following few weeks, and then continue moving additional portions as your comfort grows. The goal isn't to execute this perfectly according to some rigid formula. The goal is to actually begin, in whatever way genuinely feels sustainable for you, rather than remaining stuck in analysis and hesitation indefinitely while your excess savings continues sitting idle. Here's the mindset shift I want you to walk away with today. Saving and investing aren't competing strategies where you need to choose one over the other entirely. They're complementary tools, each suited to a different purpose, a different timeline, and a different type of money within your overall financial life. The mistake isn't saving money in the first place. Saving remains genuinely important for emergencies and near-term goals. The mistake is stopping there, treating every dollar you accumulate as if it belongs in the same account, doing the same passive, low-growth job, regardless of how far in the future you'll actually need it. The people who successfully build substantial long-term wealth aren't necessarily the ones who save the most money, or even the ones who earn the most money. They're the ones who understand this distinction clearly, who know exactly which money belongs in safe, accessible accounts, and which money should be working harder, growing over time through actual investment, and who take the concrete, specific steps to make sure their money actually ends up in the right place for its intended purpose. If this video helped you realize that some of your own savings might actually belong in an investment account instead, hit that like button. Share it with someone who's been diligently saving for years without ever making this transition, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next video, where we'll break down exactly how to choose your first investments once you've made this transition, and how to think about risk as your investment balance continues to grow over time. Because at the end of the day, saving money proves that you're disciplined. Investing that money is what actually determines whether that discipline turns into real, lasting wealth over the course of your life. See you in the next video. Until then, go take a real look at your own savings account and ask yourself honestly, how much of that money has actually been sitting there waiting for you to finally put it to work?